Good evening. My name is Monika. I'm the director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Gratz. Our online master's program was the very first in the country to offer education online concerning Holocaust and Genocide Studies. We also launched the very first Holocaust and Genocide Studies doctoral program 2 years ago, and it is likewise the very first online such program. So I invite you to explore those programs and sharing our pride about this. Tonight, I'm going to talk about recent, very disconcerting events and happenings in Poland concerning Polish-Jewish relations. Before I delve deeper into the current climate, I would like to give you a general outline of what was happening in Poland after the Holocaust. So in general, as many of you may know, right here, before the war, Poland prided itself on having the largest and the greatest Jewish diaspora in Europe. It counted over 3 million people and comprised about 10% of Polish population. In contrast to Western Europe, where Jews in France or Germany, for example, were very much assimilated and considered themselves either French or Germans of Jewish persuasion or Jewish background. In Poland, a Jewish community was very religious, traditional. 80% of Polish Jews declared Yiddish as their mother tongue. And they were also a community that was very much separated from the Polish majority. This, of course, was the result of two different mechanisms. On the one hand, the traditional Jewish community wanted to be separate. On the other hand, there was a strong antisemitism in Poland, which depicted the Jews as the ultimate other. As the result of the war and the Holocaust, over 90% of Polish Jews lost their lives. Only about 10% then who survived are not even strictly speaking Holocaust survivors. Many of them came back from the Soviet Union, where they managed to flee at the beginning of the war, or were deported by Stalin throughout the war and managed to survive there with much greater success than in occupied Poland. Immediately after the war, when the Jewish survivors started to come back, most of them were hoping for reconstituting of the pre-war Jewish community, Jewish communal life. They did not realize the extent of the destruction that happened in Poland. Especially those survivors who spent the war in the Soviet Union. Partly due to Soviet propaganda, they did not realize the extent to which Hitler was successful in annihilating Jewish community in Poland. So when they came back, they realized that the Jewish life was really not possible anymore. Many of the survivors realized that they were the only survivors from their families, or sometimes even the only survivors from whole villages and towns. So there was really no possibility of reconstituting Jewish life. The survivors were kind of aggregates. They tried to gather together and create communities, but they all came from different places with very different experiences during the war. Poland did not win the Second World War. Poland became immediately the communist country, which created a special historical narrative of the war and of national ethnic minorities. According to that narrative, Jewish victims of the war were considered basically Polish citizens. So I, for example, was taught in school that 6 million Poles died during the Second World War. And technically it was true because these were all Polish citizens. 3 of the 3 million of them were of Jewish origin, and they were they were exterminated because they were Jews. Over 2 million ethnic Poles who died during the war died as a result of the violence against Polish civilians. And so the relationship between the treatment of Polish Gentiles and Polish Jews was very different from the point of view of Hitler. However, the communist narrative equalized it, made the victims kind of subdued to this notion of Polishness, which was misrepresentation. Another aspect of the communist narrative drew on some of the old romantic themes of Polish nation. One of them was that Poland, as the country situated between Germany and Russia, between great and very usually aggressive empires, was always a victim. Poland suffered a lot throughout history. It was occupied for over 120 years. During the Second World War, it was the country that suffered the most as the country. In particular, Polish intelligentsia, those people who could carry Polish history, teach Polish culture, Polish language, and so on, were targeted by Hitler. So as the country emerged, this notion, myth of Polish victimhood was combined also with the notion of Polish innocence that allegedly Poles demonstrated during the war. Poles could only be victims. They could only be those who tried to rescue Jews heroically. And so this kind of myth, national myth, obviously is a very consoling narrative. It was very pleasing and very easy for people to adopt and to confess. I think it should be understandable from a sociological point of view that various nations, we like those kind of narratives. It's very difficult for a nation to admit its dark past, to admit problematic, troublesome aspects of the past. So this whole myth of Poland being the victim and being a hero who Poles allegedly tried to do everything to save Jews, kind of pervaded throughout the post-war period. And obviously is a historical misrepresentation as well, because in every society, there is a whole spectrum of various attitudes, ranging from heroic ones, where people do sacrifice their own lives to save another human being, throughout indifference, when majority of people is concerned with their own survival, to the other extreme, where, according to which many people were actually active in denouncing Jews in hiding, delivering them to Germans, and even participating in annihilation of the Jews in Poland. Well, because communists created the kind of narrative that could not be really discussed, could not be challenged. Jewish topics were topics of taboo. Historical research was extremely limited and also had to subscribe to a Marxist interpretation of history. Very little was done as far as debating, discussing, thinking of, working through the question of Polish-Jewish relations during the war. It was really only during the 1970s and 80s where younger people who were mostly connected with dissident groups, with groups who were later involved with Solidarity, opposing communism, started to be interested in Jewish topics. I'm trying to get a slide here. It's a little hard. I'm going to show another slide. Still not coming up. The one before. Okay, yes, that's the one. Okay, yes. Thank you, Bashir. Before I go to the revival, I also wanted to bring in the question of returns, which at some point also where a Jewish community returning encountered extreme violence. After the war, Jewish survivors were killed in Poland. This was one of the spectrum that needs to be acknowledged. And in the most infamous example, in the pogrom in Kielce in July 1946, 42 people were killed. There are also other examples of violence. Several hundred Jews were killed in so-called train action, where Jews were basically identified on a train or on a coach and pulled out from the train and killed. Modest conservative estimates talk about 500-600 people killed after the war, but more liberal, unconfirmed but kind of speculative estimates talk about up to 2,000 Jews being killed after the war in Poland. So this was not really discussed. This topic of violence was blamed on the pre-war anti-communist Polish government. The discussion really could not happen. So the nation in some ways kind of progressed perpetuating the myth of innocence and the myth of Polish victimhood until, as I mentioned, in the 1970s and 80s, when it is working now, thank you. When we can talk about a certain revival of interest in Jewish topics, in Judaism itself. It was then that young people born already after the war became interested in Jewish past. They realized that Jewish community before the war constituted such a significant part of European culture in general, and especially in Poland. They started to be interested in Jewish history, in certain artifacts that were left over after the war, especially in abandoned and often destroyed cemeteries, which some of those groups tried to revive and rebuild. There was a broad interest in Judaism and Jewish music, Jewish culture, including even cuisine, that resulted in creation of several wonderful festivals of Jewish culture, like the one in Wrocław or in Kraków that I'm showing a picture of. There was also development of connections with certain groups of Jews from America and Israel. Some of them were Hasidim who wanted to visit Poland for religious purposes. There were also more secular groups that wanted to reconnect with those groups that were open to discussing Polish Jewish past. Okay. So this is happening now. I'm talking the end of communism. There is a kind of a little bit nostalgic interest in Jewish culture and in Jewish history. That all brings us then throughout the fall of communism, and 10 years later, in the year 2000, a watershed moment happens for the Jewish-Polish relations. I'm trying to click again. There it is, okay, before. Okay, the revolutionary moment for Jewish-Polish relations after the war, really after the fall of communism, happened through the publication of the book Neighbors by Jan Gross. Jan Gross is a Jewish-Polish historian and sociologist who was expelled from Poland in 1968 during the so-called anti-Zionist campaign. He ended up in Princeton and published several analyses of Polish society under occupation, Polish experiences in the Soviet Union during the war, and so on. He was recognized by Polish president in '96 for his contribution to scholarship. He received an Order of Merit from the Polish president. However, in the year 2000, he published a book that started several years earlier. The book started when he investigated testimonies of Polish Jews in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. He came across an extremely disturbing testimony of Shmuel Wasserstein, who described a murder of Jewish inhabitants of Jedwabne, a small town in the eastern region of Poland, by the Polish neighbors. That murder happened in the summer of 1941, so during the very peculiar time when Nazi Germany attacked Soviet Russia, and as the Red Armists were retreating, fleeing towards the east. I'm trying to show the map here. Okay, right there. As you can see on this little map, this little area of purple, the most eastern purple region is the area of Białystok, where Jedwabne is located. And in this area, actually over 70 various attacks on Jews happened that some of them could be characterized as pogrom. This was the area and the time when the Soviet troops were, as I said, retreating eastwards. German troops were following them, going east, and it was the time that historians described as a sort of interregnum, where a proper administrative power was not fully established. During that time then, when the German troops, and especially Einsatzgruppen, were moving in, Himmler ordered instigation of local pogroms in this area. This was the time when Hitler was kind of experimenting with various options for the final solution, and one of them was to exterminate Jews by shootings in the East, and one of the first ideas was to try to do it with the local population. So by order of Himmler, the incoming Einsatzgruppen were calling on the local authorities and basically leaving them free hand to do away with their local Jews. So the historical context for that particular murder was that in this area, before the war, there was a very strong tradition of anti-Semitism, including among clergy. This was also a time, as we know, 2 years after the beginning of the war and 2 years after the attack and the occupation by Soviet Russia. Eastern Poland was occupied by Soviets, half of Poland, so Eastern Poland was occupied for about 2 years by that time. And this was a terror that was comparable to the Nazi terror. And this terror resulted in extremely strong reaction against, obviously against communism, which were identified with Jews. There is now, I'm coming across another myth that is part of kind of characteristic of Polish anti-Semitism, is that Jews ascribed very easily to communism. So communists in Eastern Poland were identified primarily with Jews, and their reaction then when the Soviet troops retreated was to avenge those persecutions by communists by killing, eliminating the Jews. So this was the context in which those murders in the localities in the Białystok area happened. In Jedwabne specifically, in July 9 actually, before when the Germans arrived, they left orders to do away with the local Jews, and the Polish mayor and his henchmen forced Jews to gather themselves in the main square, to pick up a statue of Lenin, parade through the town with the statue of Lenin and singing communist songs, And on the way, when they were marching, the Jews were already being killed. They were being murdered. Those who managed to survive that march were then forced into a barn and burned. So this kind of really incredible, incredibly brutal, almost medieval type murder happened really, as I said, by Polish hands, and was something that Jan Gratz, who was also a Polish Jewish historian who was brought up partly on this myth of Polish innocence, really could not live with and could not absorb. He did not know what to do with this material for 4 years. Because this didn't add up, didn't add up to the notion of Poles resisting the occupation, resisting the Nazis, and also helping the Jews. So finally, this whole material he knew it had to get out, and he wrote this extremely emotional book called The Neighbors, in which he described the events that I just summarized, basing them all on the primary survivors' accounts, which is also a new thing in Polish historiography, which likes to rely on official accounts. Well, that book created the greatest debate in post-communist Poland. It was, as I said, a watershed in the Polish-Jewish relations, and it opened the door to really incredible Polish research. On the one hand, many Poles became that, due to the strength of this research that became confirmed throughout some investigations, became convinced that the spectrum of Polish attitudes towards the Jews was more complex and more nuanced than the national narrative wanted to see it, that there were Poles who were even happy and were even willing to collaborate with Germans in killing the Jews. It's obviously a very difficult truth to accept, but the research showed that over the years, more and more Poles were able to accept that difficult truth. Doesn't mean that everybody got on the same page and was able to acknowledge all the findings that which Gratz wrote about, but more and more people were able to see the whole nuanced situation, nuanced reactions of the society. On the other hand, there was also a certain defense mechanism that certain parts of society absorbed, and they were not willing to reconsider this kind of innocence, myth of innocence. And they basically blamed Gratz and called him a liar, called his whole narrative a provocation, in which Gratz's half-Jewish origins didn't help. It seemed to kind of fit the image that these are Jews who attack the good name of Poland. So there occurred a certain polarization. On the one hand, we have people who were eager to reconsider Polish behavior during the war, and on the other, a stronger part of population that really was convinced that we do need to defend the good name of Poland more vociferously, and they were building their own sort of scholarship that was to first of all disqualify Gratz as a historian, and then to show that his sources were inadmissible, or they were of suspect origin, so they should not be admitted as historical evidence. On the other hand, this whole debate, in which really all spectrum of Polish society took part, church, politicians, journalists, historians, kind of every average people were discussing it, really created a new atmosphere in which Polish research really started to blossom. The whole debate about Jedwabne became the source of incredible top-notch research, especially connected with the Warsaw Center, Polish Center for Holocaust Research, in which Polish researchers go to the countryside and basically research and interview people who are still available. These are the last witnesses of the Polish-Jewish dynamic during the war, interview them, and take every evidence possible to reconstruct the real relationships during the war. Now, this could be done only by Poles. It's obviously those people usually don't speak other languages. And it's an extremely valuable research that shows the extent of collusion of various sections of society, various even occupations, like throughout the Polish police, the peasants, the underground, various sections of society, either colluding or resisting to some degree German annihilation of the Jews. So this research has been really top-notch, and some of it has been translated into English. And it's a great achievement and result of the debate around Jedwabne. Well, as the result of this both progress in research and debates in a more popular level, as I mentioned, more and more people were able to acknowledge the complexity of the relations of Poles towards the Jews. So the myth of Polish innocence kind of started to really break down. It seemed that to some degree, Poland even appeared as in a kind of front row of, in comparison with other nations, of how to deal with the dark past, of how to deal with nations' involvement or behavior during the war towards the Jews. And this is some of the work that all the nations in Europe have to reconsider. Considering, thinking about Eastern Europe, Poland was seen really as a firebrand ahead of Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Belarusians, in reconsidering its own attitudes towards the Jews during the war. And that was, again, obviously it doesn't mean that everybody was on the same page, but it means that the country was able slowly to consider a more complex and more nuanced perspective. Well, this is what historians and observers of the situation in Poland thought and felt quite optimistic about. As I said, Poland was seen as a kind of a model about how to deal with the dark past, how to write about, talk about, reconsider the dark sides of history. Well, this all seemed to have come into a very rude awakening last January of 2018, so over a year ago, when the Polish parliament introduced a new law that created atmosphere that seemed to deny all of those changes that I just mentioned and all of those reconsiderations. So what happened on January 26, 2018? Okay. Polish parliament passed amendment to the law that was officially to defend Poland from the charge of a phrase, Polish concentration camps. Now, what is that about? Well, some people mistakenly use the phrase Polish concentration camps, thinking about Nazi concentration camps in occupied Poland. However, this phrase really is inaccurate, and it is offensive because it implies that the concentration and death camps were organized and run by Poles, which is not true and which is offensive. So when that happens, people, once they realize it, they usually apologize. That happened with President Obama. There isn't really any intention to, throughout this phrase, to implicate Poland as the collaborator of Nazi Germany. But the defense against that phrase became the excuse for creating this new amendment. This new amendment is supposed to defend Poland from the charge of collaborating with the Nazis. And what does it exactly say? I put here on the slide the fragment that is crucial, and let me read it and focus on those words that are a little bit problematic. So this amendment states, whoever publicly and contrary to the facts attributes to the Polish nation or to the Polish state responsibility or co-responsibility for the Nazi crimes committed by the German Third Reich, or for any other offenses constituting crimes against peace, humanity, or war crimes, or otherwise grossly diminishes the responsibility of the actual perpetrators of these crimes, shall be liable to a fine or deprivation of liberty for up to 3 years. If the perpetrator of the act specified in section 1 above acts unintentionally, they shall be liable to a fine or a restriction of liberty. This act shall be applicable to a Polish citizen as well as a foreigner. Okay, this is not the whole amendment. I only showed you here a kind of crucial part. But as you can see, there are many problematic issues with this law, and it being reviewed by lawyers, it shows itself as a flop. It really cannot function as a law. It looks like a very strange concoction of claims. But first of all, if we look at the phrase contrary to the facts, like who according to this law would be defining the facts? Who would be defining what is the true interpretation and what are the facts of, let's say, Jedwabne, for example? Then what is a Polish nation? Are these Polish citizens of Polish ethnic origin? Are these all Polish citizens of any origin? What was the Polish state? Well, during the Second World War, Polish state didn't exist. There was a government in exile. Is that the body that the Polish parliament thought would be addressed in this amendment as somebody who would be responsible or not in the Nazi crimes? Then co-responsibility, what can that mean? Does it mean fulfilling a wish, a suggestion by the perpetrators, or, for example, acting under the gun, acting under the threat of one's own life? Who are the actual perpetrators? Are these the people who instigate, who inspire, who force, or are these those who pull the trigger? There's plenty of problematic issues with this formulation of this amendment. What does it mean to act unintentionally? Does somebody who unintentionally say some offensive things against Poland, should he be charged with this crime? What kind of jurisdiction, finally, does the Polish court have over a foreigner? How could a Polish court trace, monitor, and then charge a foreigner? What jurisdiction does it have to charge a foreigner with defamation of a Polish nation? And as you can see, and this is just this, it's not even the full amendment that I quoted here. There are just plenty of problematic issues that would make this law unworkable. However, the law itself aside, what it created, what it showed in Poland, was it revealed certain mechanisms in the country that seem to be absent up till now, that seem to be to our researchers and observers as something completely gone, and it seemed that Poland before that was somehow progressing towards the understanding of a more complex relationship to the Jews during the war. But now what this law revealed was that Polish nation actually was even more defensive and more accusing Gratz and scholars of the kind that he was doing with lies and with misrepresentation of history. So indeed, there are many paradoxes. I won't be able to address them all, but let me just kind of jump to the effects of the debate about that law, because the law itself is one aspect, but what really it revealed about the society is an extremely disturbing thing. Let me move them. Okay, I'll have to skip over that slide for now. I'll just bring it to the ruling Law and Justice Party, which changed climate in Poland since 2015, when since it's been in power. The Lech Kaczyński, who is the leader of the party, and is the twin brother of the Jarosław Kaczyński, who died tragically in the plane crash with 90 other Polish politicians in 2010. He leads the party in a way that is does not appear to be anti-Semitic, but appears to be very populist. And it seems that their goals are to absorb the most right-wing, most extreme political stratum, and kind of not let it get out of their own electorate. So they do cater and they do wink at certain expressions of anti-Semitism that they should normally, that they should in a kind of normal atmosphere, that they should dissociate themselves from. So for example, in 2015, kind of infamous anti-Semitic performer, I'm trying to, burn Jew in effigy in Wrocław main town square. As you can see a picture here, it had a lot of many hateful slogans that were associated with this performance. He was charged with 10 months imprisonment, which for really unknown reasons was then reduced quickly to 3 months, which kind of send a signal that those kind of hate crimes are not something that Poland has to really reckon with, and not something that Poles have to be concerned with. There are other events that that testify to the fact that this the expressions of anti-Semitism now, since the Law and Justice Party is in power, are not really a marginal phenomenon as they always were. Every country has this kind of extreme anti-Semitism somewhere on the margin, but they creep up to be a mainstream phenomenon and event. So since 2017, during the Independence March, there is a very strong, visible presence of pro-fascist, Nazi, nationalistic groups who manifest outwardly, who shout for white Poland, Poland without Jews, Poland without other minorities. Likewise, there is an increase of violence against foreigners in general, not only Jews. There always was a kind of a strong xenophobia because Polish Polish nation after the war was almost monoethnic. It was almost completely deprived of any minorities. Well, right now, when there is a huge refugee crisis all over the world and also in Europe, the incoming refugees, foreigners, are encountering great hostility. So this verbal hostility now is considered to be more frequently turning into actual violence, and violence is more and more often even directed against children. In Warsaw, for example, a 14-year-old girl was beaten on the street, and the Polish perpetrators were shouting, "Poland for Poles," things like that. There is a sharp rise in violence on the crimes committed from racial prejudice. Foreigners from Africa or from India are routinely insulted with the N-word, and this has been monitored by several agencies, and it appears to be creeping up every year higher and higher. Okay. So this is kind of on the level of society. Politicians also unfortunately took part in the discourse that appears more and more outwardly anti-Semitic. One presidential advisor claimed during the debate about this law, claimed that Israel's protest, because Israel as well as United States strongly opposed this amendment. So this presidential advisor claimed that the protest stems from, quote, a feeling of shame at the passivity of the Jews during the Holocaust, end quote. So he was implying there, kind of playing into the notion that Jews for some reasons were repeating the charge of Jews going passively, accepting their death during the Holocaust. Another example, Prime Minister Morawiecki, a few weeks after the law was passed through the parliament, poured gasoline on fire when he, during a conference in Munich, he was asked by an Israeli journalist whether the new law would criminalize him, the journalist, for saying that his parents' family members were killed after the Polish neighbors reported on them to the Germans. The Prime Minister then said, quote, "You are not going to be seen as criminal if you say that there were Polish perpetrators, as there were Jewish perpetrators, as there were Russian perpetrators, as well as Ukrainian perpetrators, not only German perpetrators," end quote. As we see, he tried to submerge, relativize the difference between perpetrators and victims, and by this act, erase any responsibility that Polish perpetrators have in elimination of the Jewish neighbors. Okay. There was, in mainstream media, there were reports of extreme anti-Semitic expressions in mainstream TV. There were Jewish guests on a talk show program that were insulted by audience, and this was not addressed in any way by the talk show hosts. Other radio talk show hosts were exchanging vicious Holocaust jokes on the air. So this is something that really kind of crossed the line from being marginal to being mainstream and right in the open in the main public discourse. This is new, and it's extremely worrying because this is something that researchers and observers, as I said, thought Poland overcame. We thought that Poland was able, after the Jedwabne controversy, really reconsider and acknowledge the complex relationship with the Jews. Well, this period after the law was passed by the parliament and was being discussed really revealed that actually not much happened, that to some degree the part of Polish population which wants to deny Polish responsibility is becoming stronger and stronger. They were just very silent for over almost those 20 years. They put away their criticism and their knowledge, their version of history kind of under the rug. And right now, when this law was being discussed, it came out very loudly and with a vengeance. So this is where the law, which eventually was abandoned, from the inspiration really of Washington. Washington did not receive Polish prime minister, didn't receive Polish president until the condition was to change the law. So this law has been changed in June 27. On June 27, it was completely removed. Within 5 hours, without any dispute, it just stopped as if it was never written. So this is obviously a great development. However, what happened before that, the demonstrations of extreme anti-Semitism remain there. They testify to what is happening in Polish society, and that is an extremely worrying situation. So I would like to end up my main narrative here and see if we have any questions concerning the events I just described. Is there static right now? I apologize.
Okay, so Dr. Rice, I have a question coming in.
Yes.
So what do you think about the recent developments between Poland and Israel, given these exchanges that are going on between the members of the Netanyahu government and the Polish Prime Minister?
Yeah, I will answer the question. Anyway, yeah, apologize. We do have some static wave. So yeah, I did want to speak about it if time allowed, but right now it came up with the question, which is great. So about a month ago, during a Middle East conference in Warsaw, Prime Minister Netanyahu shared some reflections when he visited the Museum of Polish Jews in the Museum Polin. And he said apparently that Poles cooperated with the Nazis, which by this he meant certain Poles. Well, it was consequently misrepresented by Jerusalem Post as the Poles or the Polish nation collaborated with the Nazis, which obviously conveyed a different message and sounded very offensive to Polish politicians who asked Prime Minister Netanyahu for clarification. He explained what happened, but it was still, there was a little bit of a bad feeling. Poland, the Prime Minister of Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Czech Republic were to visit Israel on their first Visegrad summit, outside of those four countries. And because of this controversy and a doubt about what Prime Minister Netanyahu actually said, Prime Minister Morawiecki said that he will not come, but he will send his foreign minister. Well, after that, a day after, a new acting Israel's foreign minister, Israel Gratz, created a completely new controversy, new crisis. He blew up the whole thing by saying that, talking to a news channel and saying that he repeated Yitzhak Shamir's dictum that Poles imbibe anti-Semitism from their mother's milk, end quote. So after he said that and he refused to apologize, Prime Minister Netanyahu refused to apologize, Poland withdrew from the summit in Israel and said, well, obviously it will not be visiting a country that expresses such racist views. This happened about a month ago, as I said. It kind of came to a standstill. It seems by analysis that it really is mostly connected with current election campaign in Israel on April 9th and also in Poland. So this seems to me more like a kind of exchange between politicians who don't necessarily believe their own words. In contrast to that, what was happening in Poland, I think, demonstrates a phenomenon that is really grassroots, showing what the kind of from bottom up, what is happening in a society on the lowest level and how people are reacting and reconsidering their relationships with the Jews. So that's how I would, it's obviously extremely worrying too, but I think this is more on a kind of symbolic level, political level, rather than level of society. Thank you for your question. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Rice.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that we have another question here.
Oh, great.
So thank you. And do you think the recent events in Poland are typical just for the Poles, or do you think that could happen in any country?
It's a great question too. Thank you. Yes, so yeah, obviously there is nothing specifically Polish about anti-Semitism. There is nothing unique that Poles inherit racially about feeling animosity to any other nation. So yes, I do believe this could happen in any other ethnic group, any other nation. It is really a combination of historical, sociological, social, and political circumstances. So to some degree, I believe it could happen to any other nation in any country. However, we do need to be concerned that with the history of Holocaust happening in Poland, where Poles were the first witnesses of the murder of the Jews, it is very important to be aware of what is happening now, to see the changes in society, or what I think is actually lack of change. It's just something that was seen as gone, but it actually was percolating under the surface. So yes, it is not obviously racially connected with Poles as ethnic group. It is connected with certain sociological processes that are happening. Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. No, I don't need the PowerPoint anymore. Thank you.
So that was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Oh.
So let's take a look here.
Mm-hmm.
So currently, now what is the role and the position of the Catholic Church?
Oh, yeah, that is also a great question. Thank you, Laurie. Great question, because the church traditionally played a very important role in Polish culture, in Polish society, in Polish resistance against oppressors of Poland throughout the history of Polish occupations, throughout the history of communism in Poland. Church was always a place of resistance, and it was a very positive role. However, it was also a place where anti-Judaism was unofficially passed on and taught. It was never part of the official teaching of the church, but it was part of an unofficial teaching of certain clergymen. And as I mentioned in Wabne, it was actually quite strong in the region of Białystok, and was also typical for many clergy during the 30s and then going throughout the war. So the situation of Catholic Church and its attitude to reconsider the relationship to the Jews also is connected with the revolution that happened after Gross's neighbors, because more and more clergy, especially well-educated clergy, Archbishop Życiński and others, were able to see through the evidence and were able to see through the need of repentance and reconciliation. So there is, again, part of clergy that is open to reconsidering Polish attitudes, which is open to seeing some parts of Polish society as involved and guilty of persecuting Jews. And there's some part of the kind of official church that is not interested in reconsidering it, and rather kind of obstinately standing by the notion that Jews are attacking Poland by those notions, by trying to bring the new historical evidence. So it's very complex. To some degree, it kind of represents the kind of division in society itself. Part of it is able to see the changes. Part of it kind of stands obstinately by the kind of old narrative. That's how I would phrase it. Thank you very much.
So we're just about done here. And thank you also, all of you out there, for joining us tonight. And I will send you an email in the next couple of days with the link to the YouTube recording of this presentation. So that will take about 2 to 3 days to get to you, and you'll be able to see the entire recording. I'd also like to say that our next presentation is Tuesday, April 16th, also at 8:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That will be with Dave Malter. He is the director of our Master of Arts in Education program, and also the director of our Camp Administration and Leadership program. He will be talking about a topic of reigniting the spark of conversation. So how has technology affected us? How do we connect again with others? I imagine that it will help all of us connect with our children and grandchildren a little bit better. So we do hope to see you Tuesday, April 16th. And again, I'm Lori, and I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.